Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Urban Planning Delegated Committee. Before we commence the meeting, I ask that everyone turns their mobile phones to silent or please switch them off. My name is Councillor Gary Thompson and I'm the Chair of the committee. The Urban Planning Delegated Committee is being live streamed on Council's website to enable public viewing of the proceedings, including councillor deliberations and voting. The meeting is also being recorded and will be made available on the Council website as soon as practically possible after the meeting. Should technical problems be encountered during the meeting will be adjourned until the problem is rectified, or if needed, the meeting will be postponed. I'll start by introducing my fellow councillors and officers. Seated to my left-hand side, closest to me, Councillor Victor Franco, Councillor Cynthia Watson, Councillor Nick Stavrou, Deputy Mayor Councillor Wes Galt, Councillor Lisa Hollingsworth, and opposite Councillor Lisa Hollingsworth is our Mayor, Councillor Jane Addis, Councillor Di Gillies, Councillor Felicity Sinfield, Councillor Susan Bigger, and Councillor Jim Park. There are a number of officers in attendance this evening, including our Chief Executive Officer, Mr Philip Storer, who's situated behind Councillor Stavrou, Mr Scott Walker, Director of Urban Living, who's seated to my immediate right, Mr David Cohen is present somewhere, Mr Brian Wee, who's situated to my left, is the Manager of Governance and Legal. Thank you. Ms Kristen Ritchie, seated to Mr Wee's left, Coordinator of Governance. Ms Elizabeth Manu, apologies, is situated to the immediate left of Mr Wee, Senior Governance Officer. We also have Mr Freer, a Director of Places and Spaces, situated behind Councillor Gillies. There'll be a number of other officers in attendance and they'll be introduced as they present their reports. Essentially, the purpose of the Urban Planning Delegated Committee is to deal with issues under the Planning and Environment Act and the Building Act. This committee has delegated authority to make decisions on behalf of Council. Councillors are familiar with the reports, which include a summary of objections received. For those in the gallery presenting this evening, when we come to the agenda item, it will be introduced by an officer. I will then call you up one by one to come forward to address the committee. If you're making a submission, please present your viewpoints clearly and precisely on why you support or oppose the applications. I'd ask that you don't repeat what previous presenters have said and keep submissions focused on relevant issues and points not previously raised. If you're opposed to the planning applications, please inform the committee why you're opposed and suggest an alternative approach which would satisfy your concerns. Please focus on your concerns rather than matters of history or details in the officer's report. There are a number of presenters tonight, so there will be a strict time limit of 3 minutes for each speaker. That includes councillors. And whilst as chairperson I reserve the right to vary that, I will not be doing so tonight. And I'll ask that each speaker comes to the horseshoe table, and at the 2.5 minute mark, I'll ring this bell to indicate that you have 30 seconds to conclude your presentation. Apologies. Mr Weir, are there any apologies this evening?
Through you, Chair, no apologies.
Thank you. Move through to item 1 on the order of business, adoption and confirmation of the minutes of the Urban Planning Delegated Committee meeting held on the 2nd of May 2022. Councillors, I'm in search of a motion. I've got Councillor Sinfield.
So moved.
Thank you. And seconded Councillor Gillies. Is there any opposition to this item? I declare there is none, so I'll declare the motion carried. Thank you, councillors. Item 2, declaration of conflict of interest of any councillor or council officer. Are there any conflicts this evening? There being no conflicts, thank you. We'll move on to presentations of officers' reports. Item 3.1, environmentally sustainable design planning policy. resolution to commence a planning scheme amendment. And this will be introduced by the reporting officer, Mr Nick Brennan, Senior Strategic Planner.
Thank you, Mr Chair, and through you. In the last 12 months, Council has become a member of the Council Alliance for a Sustainable Built Environment and has recruited a dedicated ESD officer to assist with the assessment of planning permit applications. However, there is still no dedicated ESD planning policy within the Boroondara planning scheme. To address this policy gap, Council joined the Elevating ESD Targets Planning Policy Project together with 30 other councils in June 2021. Stage 1 of that project has now concluded with the production of a draft ESD planning policy and supporting technical reports. Stage 2 will involve the planning scheme amendment to implement the planning policy developed in Stage 1. Council officers have provided feedback through the drafting of the planning policy. The working group have adopted this version of the planning policy as the form to be used in the group planning scheme amendment. For this reason, Council is not able to make any further changes to the policy at this stage of the process. While the policy does not include any planning permit triggers, assessment against the provision would be required for many planning permit applications, including multi-dwelling developments and commercial developments. Joining Stage 2 will enable member councils to share costs associated with the planning scheme amendment process. These include panel costs, legal representation and expert witness costs. A joint amendment process between many councils will also ensure a consistent process and policy outcome for each council and their customers, and will demonstrate to the Minister for Planning that there is a significant support for this ESD policy. Officers are now recommending that the UPDC resolve to join Stage 2 of the Elevating ESD Targets Planning Policy Project, to adopt the draft ESD planning policy, and to seek authorisation from the Minister for Planning to prepare and exhibit a planning scheme amendment to introduce the planning policy into the Boroondara planning scheme. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Brennan. Councillors, we have one presenter on this item who is against, and I'll call forward Mr Andrew Nunn to come forward. Is Mr Nunn here? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor, for giving us the opportunity.
Nunn. If we can just commence with your name and
Andrew
your suburb.
Nunn, my address is 78 Wattle Road, Hawthorn.
Thank you, and I'll commence your 3-minute presentation. Thank you.
Look, I thank you for the opportunity to talk about this, because in fact I only just became aware of this proposal, and I suppose my concern here is there is a lot of unfinished business in the Boroondara area, and history is important. The history of planning and the decisions about heritage, and the need to constantly upgrade the thinking around heritage. The flowchart's quite good. I like flowcharts.
Mr Nunn, sorry, if I can just stop you there. I believe you're talking with regards to the heritage nominations.
Yeah, sorry.
Which is item 3.2.
Oh, I'm very sorry.
That's all right. What I'll do is I'll put you to the list on 3.2.
Okay.
How does that
Sorry
sound?
about that.
Thank you. On that basis, councillors, there are no presenters for this item. Unless there are any presenters who filled out a form, I don't believe there are. No. So councillors will return to matters arising, which there are none from the officers. So questions of officers. Councillors, are there any questions of officers? Councillor Galt.
No questions at this time, but I would like to foreshadow a motion. Thank you.
Thank you, and noted, Councillor Galt. Councillor Franco.
Thanks. In relation to the possibility that there might be friction, say, between this ESD policy, were it to be adopted, and, say, our heritage policy, for example, in respect of solar panels, how might such conflicts be resolved or decided?
Through you, Mr Chair. That is essentially the job of the planning permit assessment process and the job of officers. There are various issues that may have differing goals or potentially clashing goals. For instance, the SBO, special building overlay, may require floor levels to be raised, and the heritage overlay may require that sort of work to have consideration of facades. The job of the planning permit assessment process is to determine the best outcome, weighing up those policy objectives and determining what the best way to govern those potentially conflicting issues is.
Thanks. One further question. The open space provisions in this draft policy are significant, and I welcome those. How our existing open space provisions are not within the planning scheme. I'm not sure their specific location right now, but they're not as onerous, let's say. How would that conflict potentially be determined? Would these take primacy?
Through you, Chair, were this policy to be introduced into the planning scheme, then yes, this would take precedence over another policy that required less.
And finally, just in terms of the treatments of swimming pools, which could be classified as open space, it doesn't appear that they could be classified as open space under this policy, as green open space. Is that the case? So that would rule out that use of a swimming pool as green open space.
Through you, Chair. So this policy would be dealing more with the provision of vegetation and cooling and greening through the presence of trees, which obviously a pool would not achieve the objectives of.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Franco. I have Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Just one question, Mr Brennan, with regard to stage 2. Are you able to give an indicative time frame of how long you think this will take to go through the administrative process before it comes back to the chamber?
Through you, Mr Chair, not really. This is the next stage in this process is the however many councils resolve to join stage 2 will write to the Minister for Planning seeking authorisation. There's no time limit in which the Minister is required to make a decision on that application. The previous time that councils, not Burundara, other councils attempted to introduce a new ESD planning provision, the Minister sat on some of those applications for more than a year. So we are hoping that the weight of numbers in this case will bring a more pressing case to the Minister, but I'm unable to say how long he may take to make a decision.
Right, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hollingsworth. There doesn't appear to be any questions, but before I come to the mover, Mr Nunn, who came up before, can I just have one final confirmation from you that you're here for the community heritage? Thank you. Good day. Councillor Galt, you foreshadowed a motion.
Thank you. I'd like to move that we adopt the officer's recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor Galt. And I have a second, Councillor Park.
Yes, happy to second that.
Thank you. To assist Councillor Gold, is there any opposition on this item? There being none, Councillor Gott, as this is an important bit of policy development, do you wish to speak to your motion?
I do. Thanks very much, Chair. I'd like to start by thanking the officers for working so closely with CASB, and I believe up to 30 other councils to establish these particular provisions. I think they're excellent, they're comprehensive, long overdue, and a series of wonderful recommendations have come out of it. My feelings are that we're faced in dealing with these sorts of issues that 98% at least of emissions within our community come from the community themselves. And we have serious targets under the Climate Action Plan of 60% reduction by 2030 and 100% by 2040. And there's many other things are locked in because climate change is well underway. Yet, generally, we have got little more than persuasion or encouragement to encourage people to come with us and make those changes. And one of the real opportunities we have is introducing it through building projects. It introduces opportunities in sustainability and resilience. So the proposed particular provisions are the only mandatory measure I can see so far that we have of introducing some serious action within the community beyond the goodwill of our populace. So, and the other thing that's wonderful about this is you work with other councils, hence reducing the costs to everyone of going through this and getting, as you've already said, more power when you go forward to the Minister. So I urge my colleagues to support the officer's recommendation tonight. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Councillor Galt. As there was no opposition on this item, I'll put the motion to the vote. All those in favour? Declare that carried unanimously. Thank you, councillors. We'll move on to item 3.2, Community Heritage Nomination Process. And this will be introduced by Mr. Christian Wilmson, Coordinator of Strategic Planning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The purpose of this report is to seek a resolution from the committee to adopt the community heritage nomination process shown in the process chart at attachment 1 of the report. The background for this report is that in recent years, the strategic planning team has received increasing numbers of community requests to assess and protect properties through the application of the heritage overlay. In many instances, those properties and places had already been considered through the preparation of previous gap studies or older heritage studies that recommended them not to be included in the heritage overlay. In the past, requests to assess or reassess these places have been responded to individually in an ad hoc manner. However, assessing these nominations individually and then potentially initiating a planning scheme amendment to apply the heritage overlay is not efficient and has limited the strategic planning team's ability to deliver other important strategic planning projects. The proposed process has been designed to provide a clearer framework for how Council will manage community nominations. It provides a more efficient, consistent and transparent approach to the assessment of heritage nominations coming from the community, and it will allow Council to focus its resources on those properties and precincts that truly require assessment. It's important to note that this process does not impact on Council's ability or willingness to initiate and undertake strategic heritage studies and reviews as the need arises. It's also important to note that this process does not impact any current heritage projects that are underway, such as the consideration of Rosebery Street Community Heritage Nomination, the community nomination of Wattle Road. Those projects will continue to be progressed with the matters brought back to the chamber at the appropriate time when we have recommendations from the heritage consultants and decisions need to be made about how to proceed with those. So that's not impacted by this process at all. The community nominations through this process will initially be assessed against a key eligibility criteria to ensure that the nomination have sufficient merit to justify further investigation. The nominated places will not be considered eligible for further investigation where the place has previously been subject of an assessment by Council's heritage consultant that found that it did not meet the threshold for inclusion in the heritage overlay, either as an individual place or as part of a precinct. Where a place previously was not assessed through any of the gap studies or prior work, Council will still be undertaking an assessment at that point in time. And that assessment will consider all the relevant heritage criteria that are the basis for heritage assessment within Victoria. The other eligibility criteria is that the place has not been subject to a previous planning scheme amendment or a recommendation by the panel or a decision by Council or the Minister for Planning not to proceed with the heritage overlay and that the heritage overlay was not justified. Where those two eligibility criteria are not met, there's also a proposal to allow reinvestigation of a place where new substantial information and evidence can be provided to substantiate a heritage significance under criterion H, which is associative significance. This is to reflect that places that have associative significance, they're not readily identifiable through a site visit, and if you write down the street because the architecture is not the reason for their significance, it's the association. So in those instances, there's recognition that there might be something there, and that's why criterion H will be considered in those circumstances. Once the nomination has been accepted and it meets the eligibility criteria, the applications will be assessed under two separate streams. One stream is for those properties that are under threat of demolition, which will be, those are places that are subject either to a Section 29A demolition application or where there's a planning permit application that implies demolition of the property. Those properties will undergo an immediate assessment, and if the assessment determines that the site is of individual significance or justified to be included in the heritage overlay, Council will be seeking interim protection and commence the amendment process to apply the heritage overlay on a permanent basis. The other stream is for properties that are not under threat of demolition. Those properties will be added to a list of properties for further investigation in the future, and then periodically all the properties on that list will be given to a heritage consultant, and they will undertake the assessment, and then the amendment process will commence through that process with a preliminary consultation on draft citations prior to that as well. To support the implementation of this process, Council will need to engage heritage consultants to assist in undertaking the assessments. Current contracts can't cover this, and because this is a new process and potentially quite resource intensive, there will also be an evaluation after the first 12 months to determine whether the process as it is works or whether adjustments need to be made to the process. And that review will consider issues such as the success by Council of actually introducing heritage controls over the properties, the cost of heritage consultants and the resource impacts, the impact on other strategic work that needs to be progressed, and Council has an obligation to deliver, and feedback from nominators and affected property owners. That concludes. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Wilmson, for your presentation. So, councillors, we have 20 presentations this evening, 18 against the officer's recommendation, 1 unsure and 1 for. I'll call forward our presenters shortly, but I'll just ask those that are seeking to present tonight. There are a number of presenters, so in the spirit of having a efficient meeting tonight, if an earlier presenter presents something that you would like to say, you can put your hand up to me as I call your name and say it's already been covered by an earlier presenter, and there'll be no requirement for you to come forward and present. So I'll be looking for themes as well as we go through. So I'll call forward our first presenter, and I'm going to start with Mr. Nunn, who sat at the table just before, and followed by Mr. Nunn will be Miss Elisa Wilson. So if Mr. Nunn can come forward, please. I think we've got the right agenda item for you this time, Mr. Nunn. That's all right. If we can just commence with your name and your suburb.
78 Wattle Road, Hawthorne.
That's right, and your 3-minute presentation. Thank you.
Look, I'm just saying before, it's an opportunity that I think we need to have as the community to look at heritage. When you look at heritage being dictated by the history of previous assessments of history, and they do change, and I think they shouldn't necessarily affect the nomination process. By example, I live at 78 Wattle Road, as I said. The place next door is going to have 10 houses put on it. A demolition company came to my house last week wanting to knock it over, or talked about knocking it over, and I said, sorry, you've got the wrong house, but it's quite understandable. It's just exactly the same house next door, but it was taken off the heritage list 10 years ago. And this reflects the issues with the reports from Gould and Chen, which are good reports, but the reports actually are then acted on, and there was a massive delisting of houses in our street at that time. And it seemed to me, and I'm being pretty basic, that Lisson Grove and Mannington Road were preserved as precincts, and Wattle Valley Road was seen as the sacrifice to meet clear and obvious government politics. So I'd like to propose that we are extremely careful about using history to judge the present. And I know it's hard work, and I appreciate the cost of this to council, but some of these, there's a big blur about the last Gen report, and it needs to be reviewed. Some of those houses taken off the list are actually very significant. So I'll just finish with that, because I think other people will have something to say.
Thank you, Mr Nunn. Just before you go, make sure that there are no questions. There are none from... Thank you. There are no questions, Mr Nunn, so thank you for that. And welcome to the table, Ms Wilson. If we can commence with your name and your suburb. And just after you will be Mr Arbon. Thank you.
Sure. It's actually Ailsa Wilson, which is quite hard to pronounce.
Thank you,
And
Ailsa.
I live at 50A Kooyongkoot Road. And I've come tonight at fairly short notice because I think I've been involved in a recent practical example that some of the new councillors may not know about that is very relevant to this topic. And that is in relation to the Edwardian villa at number 57 Barclay Street, and that the neighbours with me in the FOG campaign brought to council's attention in the last 2 or 3 years. And I totally understand it by quick reading that this is well progressed, this house is well progressed in the process, and it will not be threatened by the new process. What I want to explain is that as a resident without planning training, my understanding and many of my neighbours will think the same thing. So even if I'm incorrect, it's good for you to know that our perspective is that if nobody was trying to demolish this house, it was just the most significant house on the Scotch Hill that had history and heritage that everybody recognised, that everybody thought was beautiful. Residents were concerned that it should always be recognised and be safe, and so me and 16 of my neighbours did written submissions on 2 different occasions, and that led to, in conjunction with council strategic planning people listening, to they and the councillors deciding that even though the context generic study in early 2000, and I don't have the exact dates with me, and around 2009 and 2011 had not classified this as either a significant house or a heritage house, and it wasn't in a precinct, that because the neighbours brought forward so many examples, they would go to a heritage architect, which was Mr Briggs. His detailed assessment of that property and his detailed report showed that rather than being a Queen Anne house with 3 characteristics, it was in fact an early Edwardian house with 11 significant characteristics, at least 7 of which were unique, and it was actually a better example than some in Grace Park. So while we understand that there's nothing in the Scotch Hill that is considered to be either heritage or a precinct, the reality is the architect's report classified the Rendo stuccoed walls and the unique roof and the unique lead light windows and the unique large L-shaped garden. And we feel if we hadn't done this and we hadn't got 2,500 people to sign our petition and the Age hadn't done the article, that this might have not been thought about at all. And the last closing statement is this suggests that for a long time it would be helpful for all of us if there was a clear heritage plan and strategy.
Thank you, Ms Wilson, for your presentation. Councillors, are there any questions of Ms Wilson this evening? There being none, you may return to the gallery. Thank you for your presentation. Our next presenter this evening is Mr Arbon. If Mr Arbon can come forward, thank you. And followed by Ms Brannigan. Thank you, Mr Arbon. If we can just commence with your name and your suburb, plus your 3-minute presentation.
Yep.
Thank you.
My name is Richard Arbon, and I live in Camberwell, and I've lived here for about 20 odd years. So, dear Mayor, councillors and council officers, actually listening to the person immediately before me, and I think she really was making a very good point. And I guess the underlying point she was making is, if we look into the history of decisions that council have made, and I'm not talking about anybody individually, but the decisions that council have made about properties, they've often been flawed. That's not blaming anybody, but it's just the reality of what's happened. There is countless properties out there which, and I can cite a few and I won't because it starts to waste time, countless properties out there which, with a different perspective on them and more information, have turned out to be something that they weren't originally deemed to be. The legislation, or rather the ruling that is now being sought to be put in, which I have to say seems to me really rushed, is clearly about council efficiency and saving money and trying to let people get on with strategic planning issues, which actually does not address what I've just talked about. Council is not infallible, council officers are not infallible, heritage consultants are not infallible, but when you make big far-reaching decisions about properties, in other words, they can be knocked down, they can be redeveloped, and they've gone forever, and they've gone for future generations. So I would really very much like to say that I think this matter should be urgently withdrawn from council, and there needs to be reconsideration, and there needs to be proper public consultation before anything is brought forward again. In the Burundara Community Plan 2021-31, you actually, there's a couple of themes in here which are your own words. Theme 7, page 50 states, we, the community, expect to be consulted. If we then look on page 10, a message from councillors clearly states, it remains imperative to listen to our community and make sure a variety of views are represented. Do these words have meaning, or are they just there for us to just all kind of feel nice about? It's entirely reasonable, right and proper that residents, ratepayers in this area are allowed to have proper consultation before something like this is allowed to pass through. Something that looks innocuous, but actually is going to be potentially hugely damaging. Let's not compound heritage errors of the past with yet another bad decision, but this time potentially a really huge error because of ill-thought-through, rushed decision-making, which is being put in place for who knows what reasons. So I think this matter needs to be withdrawn from council business tonight. I'm sure a lot of other people would agree with me, and a proper consultative process needs to be put in place. Or, as more and more of us are fearing, and more of us are talking around in the community, and there's a lot of us, is there actually another agenda here? One which sees that there's an effort being put through here to gag residents because it's inconvenient to listen to our perspectives on heritage. And I really would ask you to think about that. Are we being gagged? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Arbon. Councillors, are there any questions of Mr Arbon? If I could please ask the gallery not to applaud every presentation. Councillors, are there any questions of Mr Arbon? There being none, Mr Arbon, thank you for your presentation. You may return to the gallery. Thank you. Our next presenter is Ms Christina Brannigan. Welcome, Ms Brannigan. Thank you. And just following Mr Richard Arbon following. Thank you. Ms Brannigan, if we can commence with your name and your suburb and your 3-minute presentation. Thank you.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. I'm Christina Brannigan. I live in Camberwell. Unfortunately, with respect, I really do think this new process, which only a small group of us were shown last Wednesday, really is unfair and does seem to show little respect for residents. And I might even say perhaps even impacts our human rights. It seems to have many practical flaws, and we do ask that you defer so there can be further work and also some community consultation. We have, really grave worries. Residents came to you asking for a nomination process. That's, I think, why it's been put forward, because there's distress amongst thousands of us about the destruction of heritage, and because Council's current nomination process outside of the gap studies actually doesn't exist, there isn't one. And in every community nomination that I've seen attempted in the last couple of years, it's always begun, I have to say, generally with a no from planning, unless a council has been very, very involved. And even then, it's proved to be a very stressful and time-consuming process for people, and I've seen so many residents abandon things and feel powerless. And what's proposed now is not going to help residents and will lead to vastly less community nominations, which therefore would seem to be the intent to us of this proposal. So firstly, restricting nominations to places that were not included in past studies will effectively permit blocking of almost every nomination, since in theory almost all streets were covered in the heritage gap studies. It's a complete flaw in the process. Council's undertaken studies for years and years and knows that things are not perfect and that places get missed or excluded. Secondly, there are several examples of places that were not picked up or chosen to be pursued in recent gap studies, and now they are going to be protected due to community nominations. We heard the lady from the Berkeley Street group. There are others around Robin Boyd, houses on Prospect Hill Road. I sent in examples of 10 to a number of councillors a couple of days ago in Hawthorne, Balwyn North and Camberwell. These are all places that are going to be protected now because community came forward and said, hey, the gap study didn't quite get that right. Obviously, Rosebery Street and Wattle Road would also have been blocked if this were pushed through. Criterion H, Council well knows that Criterion H is the most difficult one to achieve protection with on a sole basis. And it's actually about association with a significant person. So it's a really, really tight little niche. I think there's only one place in Burundara that's protected solely on the basis of a person of significance to history. It's going to completely not allow us to use Criterion H, which is the general historical one that generally gets used, or Criterion D around architecture. Surely we as citizens have a right to use all the heritage criteria that it's available to council, to the state and to heritage experts. I really feel it's a poorly thought through process. It seems rather than helping residents or our heritage, it's designed to alleviate resourcing issues and strategic planning, which may well, of course, be there. And if strategic planning is overloaded, then the solution for council is to look at its own systems and structures, not to exclude us, the residents.
Ms Brannigan, if you can just wind up. Thank you.
Okay. So we would really ask that you defer making any decisions, please, tonight, until after a considered review and involving the community, as we would expect. Thank you.
Thank you. We do have a question, Ms Brannigan, from Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Ms Brannigan, thank you for your presentation. You mentioned defer. Would you, are you satisfied with the current method of heritage assessment? Does that satisfy your, I suppose, desire to have the ability to put forward community nominations?
Do you mean the way council goes about assessing places or the nomination process today?
When you mentioned to defer this to another time, would you also support if this recommendation was not supported and that status quo remains?
I don't know how to answer that question, Councillor Hollingsworth, because I only had since Wednesday afternoon to think about it. I think that probably the status quo is better, yes, given that I was a part of the group that was pushed last year to have a community heritage nomination process. We were hoping it was going to help residents and that it was going to enable us to put forward places in a less stressful and reasonable way that would help council and ourselves. I feel that this is actually truly detrimental to the community, and potentially we'll miss out on places over the years that we could protect.
Thank you.
Definitely.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hollingsworth. And there appears to be no further questions, Ms Brannigan. You may... Oh, sorry. Apologies. Councillor Biggar.
I jumped in there late. Can I just to follow up on that? Were you ever when you I think you said that you or members of the community did suggest that there should be a community nomination process, and did you ever give any feedback to officers about what that might look like? Did you have an idea? No structure?
No, we put it in a couple of the Burundara Heritage Group submissions, I think, yes, last year and the previous year. We didn't ever had we had no discussions with anyone in strategic planning or councillors about what that process would be. Since then, suddenly it was bolt out of the blue on Wednesday afternoon. Got copied on a circulation list to historical societies and the National Trust.
Great, thanks, Christina.
Thank you, Councillor Biggar. No further questions from councillors. Thank you, Ms Brannigan, for your presentation. Our next presenter to come forward is Mr Richard Arbon, followed by Mr Graham Henderson. Mr Arbon, if you can take a seat, and commence with your name and your suburb and your 3-minute presentation. Thank you.
My name is Joshua Alban. I think you have me mixed up with my dad in the back. I live on Brinsley Road in Camberwell. I'm 22 years old and I live in Campbell, and I've lived here my entire life. One thing that I love about this area and Burundara as a whole are the old buildings, the old streets, the green suburbs, the trees, the parks. It's extremely important to the character of the area, and I know that's something that's held by not just my friends, but people that don't live in the area that I know at work or at university. Lots of people love Burundara for that. It's a suburb that I'm lucky to live in, and that in the future, if I'm able to, I'd love to live in and raise a family with. I also hope that as I get older, how this suburb looks and what decisions are made about how it will look, and therefore about the character of the suburb itself, are made in a way that allow people to have an input into these decisions and that respects their opinion. I don't want to be rude, but as has obviously been mentioned before, this heritage nomination process, this new one being proposed, is obviously doing the exact opposite of that. It's clear to everyone here that there are some things that are being cut out, and people, as Christina mentioned earlier, are being given less scope than council would have otherwise, to less criteria that they can use to suggest things to council. Not only will my view and many other people's, hundreds, thousands of people, young people, old people, everyone in Burundara will face these issues and whose voices will not be heard properly. What's being proposed is not democratic and is a really bad sign that people's, as has been mentioned, opinions will not be respected, and it sets a really bad precedent for the future for things to potentially get worse or better, but, well, worse, absolutely not better. What is ultimately being proposed would give residents no scope to correct mistakes that council and community members know have been made in the past, and as Christina mentioned, have been, when necessary, have been rectified, and it's been good that people brought them to the council. Council and residents know these mistakes have been made, and yet this proposal would reduce the scrutiny on council and departments to have to be accountable for the decisions they've made. It would give them potentially the opportunity to do things kind of carte blanche, are not being questioned properly, because criterion H is evidently an extremely difficult criterion to prove. This proposal really suggests that, again, council would have no scrutiny, and that ultimately it would remove the voice of the residents of Burundara, the ratepayers, and the people that vote for council would have no say in what goes next. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Arbon. Councillors, are there any questions of Mr. Arbon? There appears to be none. Thank you for your presentation. Our next presenter this evening is Mr. Henderson, and following Mr. Henderson, if I can call forward Mr. Steve Thorne after Mr. Henderson. Thank you, Mr. Henderson. If we can commence with your name and your suburb, followed by your 3-minute presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Graham Henderson. I live in Hawthorn. I live in Wattle Road, actually. And I'm not a heritage person. My interest in this is as a person who thinks that we ought to be considering how we manage the process of what we do. And I've read through the document that you're discussing, and I must say I came across it by accident. So I would say that one of the most effective ways to reduce cost, which I understand is one of the objectives you have, is to ensure that there is an alignment between the process of owners, council and nominators right from the beginning. There is a really strong push in our community for transparency and integrity, and I just don't see that surfacing in what I've observed. And so many people talk about that, but it actually is not what's happening, and it is not what is in the process. If what I'm saying is not correct, then the minority are calling the shots in this process. I think that so I don't support the process that's there. And my questions are the transparency of the nominations, the qualifications of the people putting up those nominations, the awareness of self-interest of people putting up those nominations. And we can hear lots of people talk about what they want to do to other people's properties. Strategy 4.6 talks about engagement with owners and developers. And so my question about that is, which owners are we actually talking about here? And how will council measure the success or the value of this process? Who actually ends up paying the price for this resolution? And I mean the actual cost of doing this. It seems to me that we have a process here which is going to give people who have an opinion to drive an outcome, and whether that's a hidden agenda or what, I don't really know, but that price is going to be picked up by me as a ratepayer and everybody else who's a ratepayer who lives in Boroondara, and those nominations are coming from a minority. So you asked the question earlier about what would I suggest as would solve this. I think the lowest cost way to run this process to get the most effective outcome in the shortest time is to have owners of properties self-nominate their properties. You would have no arguments then.
Mr Henderson, if you can just wrap up your presentation. Thank you.
I think the concept of putting properties into potential heritage is a terrible thing to do to people. It introduces enormous uncertainty. So,
thank you.
That's my view.
Thank you. Councillors, are there any questions of Mr Henderson? There appears to be no questions. Thank you for your presentation. Our next presenter this evening, Mr Thorne, followed by Ms Jan Dimmick. Thank you, Mr Thorne. If we can commence with your name and your suburb, followed by your 3-minute presentation. Thank you.
Steve Thorne, Hawthorne.
Thank you.
Good evening, councillors. Thank you for this opportunity to speak on this item. I live in Wattle Road. I'm also a practising architect and urban designer. I've held various senior positions, including Director of Urban Design in the Victorian State Government and Principal Urban Designer at the City of Melbourne. I mention this because I'm most concerned about the development of what I feel is a poor policy, and I would like to suggest a way to improve this draft. I refer in particular to the key eligibility criteria against which community nominations will be assessed. These state that places will not be considered for further investigation where the place has previously been subject of an assessment that found it did not meet the threshold for local significance for inclusion in the heritage overlay. As councillors will be aware, this reduces the ability for heritage to be assessed in a dynamic process rather than as a static condition, which this policy suggests. If places have previously been excluded from inclusion in the heritage overlay, they can never be included in future unless new information comes to light. I would ask that those who drafted this nomination process as to whether they seek to change the provisions of the Heritage Act of 2017, because that is what this draft policy suggests, a challenge to that act, rather than an in perpetuity exclusion of places for possible consideration. The Act clearly identifies the criteria for exclusion for heritage nominations as 1, places which in the previous 5 years were refused a nomination on the grounds that the place had no reasonable prospect of inclusion in the Heritage Register, and 2, new information in relation to a place is produced, which was not previously known when the nomination for registration was rejected. If Heritage Victoria rejects a place for nomination, the nominee still has the ability to appeal to the Heritage Council. This seems a more reasonable approach to the nomination process than this draft suggests. The report to the UPDC states that the overriding objective of this suggested process is to save officers time and resources, rather than the community objective of saving places it considers to be of value. I would ask, therefore, that the criteria for evaluation as outlined in the Heritage Act be adopted rather than those contained in this draft policy, which will remove Council's ability to re-evaluate places in future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr Thorne. Thank you, Gallery. Councillors, there are questions of you, Mr Thorne. Councillor Park, followed by Councillor Franco.
Thank you, Chair. There's been reference to the various criteria that is followed by the Heritage Council. There's particular reference to criterion H, and you'd be familiar with those?
I've become familiar with it tonight.
Yeah. Do you consider that, I'd be interested to hear what your view is about if Council adopted a more broad approach but still narrowed it, say, to exclude criterion D and criterion E, whether that would be a sufficient broadening of what's proposed, that would be a better outcome.
Councillor, I think the point that I'm trying to make is that this sort of curtain that drops if something has been nominated in the past and therefore isn't allowed to be reevaluated at some point, that it's too onerous, that the 5 years is actually a reasonable way of approaching this.
Just leaving aside that question of time,
yep.
I've a follow-up question about that, but just focusing on the criteria, and effectively that would take out the purely aesthetic characteristics in particular to focus on the other ones. Do you have a view about that, as I say, leaving aside the time?
I think all criteria need to be assessed at every time.
Yeah. And
just order, please. Can I ask the gallery not to applaud? We do need councillors to be able to hear what the presenters are speaking, and it's important that the presenters are able to communicate clearly with councillors. Thank you. Councillor Park.
And I, for example, see some merit in a time frame, but I think 5 is too short. Do you have any view about 10?
It wouldn't be up to myself. It would be up to the Planning Minister to assess whether or not what you're suggesting fits with the Act.
This is our policy, so it'll be determined here.
It is, but the Planning Minister would have a view, I would think.
But do you have a view about whether...
I have a view that I think 5 years is probably about right. If in addition to that, more new information becomes available. So it can be reapplied after 5 years if there's new information. It's those two things combined which are quite significant.
What do you see as the significance of 5 years? I mean, in the scheme of things, that seems quite short. And as I say, we're not really interested in the terms of the Act here because that legislation has a specific purpose. What is it that you see as driving that imperative for it to be that soon?
I think there's an energy around a nomination, and that if rejected, there is a reasonable time frame where additional information could be found, and 5 years seems to me about reasonable. 10 years, those folks might have moved on, and so that energy is dissipated. So I think 5 years is about right.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Park. Mr Thorne, we do have 2 other questions. Firstly from Councillor Franco, and I note Councillor Watson also has her light on.
Thank you. Putting aside the issue of the years, I want to focus on a different aspect. Where a proposal has previously been assessed or rejected by council, if the criteria were, say, substantial new information is provided under any category, is that exactly what you're suggesting? So under any category, substantial new information where it's previously been assessed.
It's a combination of that and the time frame that I'm suggesting should go hand in hand.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Franco. Councillor Watson.
Thank you for your presentation, Mr Thorne. I guess my question is fairly general, and it's your view on whether this sort of process is actually out of alignment or within the alignment of the objectives and the rules outlined by the Minister for Planning. Because just interested in your sense was whether you think this is a good alignment or it isn't.
I can't speak for the Minister, but all the previous ministers I worked for. But I think it is out of alignment. I think the time frame and a reasonable approach to this is out of alignment. And I think the objectives, as stated in the report, put aside the council's ability to go back and revisit things, as well as the community's ability. So I think in that, there would be question marks about the process.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thorne.
Thank you, Mr. Thorne. If I may actually ask a question as well, Mr. Thorne. With regard to, I know Councillor Park and Councillor Franco have spoken about time. If we were to put that aside for the moment and focus on new information, is there benefit to new information being provided absent of time?
I don't think there is. I think the time aspect is quite an important component of this. And as I suggested, it's the energy that is required to assemble this information. And that gets dissipated over time.
If I may rephrase the question, if something were to be presented within 3 years of it previously being considered, would you defer it for the full 5 years?
I think 3 years is too short.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Thorne. Thank you for your responses to councillors' questions. You may return to the gallery. Thank you. If I can call upon our next presenter, Ms. Jan Dimmick, if you can come forward. Ms. Dimmick, do you wish to present?
I realise I've had my turn. I've driven my 94-year-old neighbour because her daughters were unavailable because she thought it was important. But she only found out about this meeting yesterday, and I think you all know she's lived here her whole life and she doesn't feel able to speak tonight. But she wanted to be here.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. We'll move forward to our next presenter, Mr. Peter Robinson, if you can come forward. And following Mr. Robinson, Ms. Mary Drost. Mr. Robinson, if we can commence with your name, followed by your address and your 3-minute presentation. Thank you.
Sure. Peter Robinson, living in Camberwell. I am on the committee for BRAG, the Burundall Residents Action Group as well. Trying to fill the massive shoes left by Mary and Jack Roach. I want to just reinforce the position of Mr. Thorne before, so I'll probably truncate my presentation, but you pick up the Herald Sun every second day and you see the scrutiny that councils face and the need to be finely tuned with the ratepayers and what they're trying to achieve. And I think as much as you probably feel you get beaten up by the ratepayers a lot, I actually think you're doing a pretty good job. Heritage is clearly being lifted in the eyes of this council, and it's quite evident. We're seeing time and time again where we're putting forward objections and they're being heard, and that's really important, so thank you for that. I actually think the process is not necessarily at fault, but I do think the criteria and some of the time aspects need to be considered again. I also think that funding needs to be appropriate for these activities. You've got a big ask on your capital budget. I know you're spending a lot on ICT, for example, but this is a really important part of the community, and you are guardians, you're stewards of a really special part of Melbourne. I just don't think there are many councils that could compete for the amenity and the beauty that we have in this particular council. So that's hard because you've got to balance your budgets, you've got to direct your activities where they're most effective. So an improved process is a good thing if it makes you more efficient, but this process will not be effective unless you fund it appropriately. You've got to give the horsepower to the council staff to be able to manage this process effectively, and clearly there needs to be some tweaking to it. But that's my request of you. But can I commend you for what you're doing to date, because I think you're heading in the right direction, because a few years ago, heritage was like a dirty word, and it's not the case anymore. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Robinson, for your presentation. There appears to be no questions from councillors. You may return to the gallery. Thank you. Our next presenter, Ms. Mary Drost, who's well known to this committee. If you can come forward. Thank you, Ms Drost. If we can just commence with your name and your suburb and your 3-minute presentation. Thank you.
Yes, I'm Mary Drost and I live in Camberwell, not very far away. And I once sat where you sit.
And Ms Drost, is it possible just to move that microphone a little bit closer to you?
Closer?
Yeah.
Not loud enough?
That's better, thank you.
All right, that better? You can hear now? Yes, well, I start again. I once sat where you sit, okay, when I was a councillor here about 40 years ago. And one of the things we did then was to bring in the very first heritage protection. And it was Camberwell then. Burke Road was the dividing point. And we made the area from Canterbury Road to Riversdale Road heritage, all the way back. And if you drive around there now, that area, it's hardly changed in those years. They're all Edwardian Victorian houses. I live there, all right, and so I know it very well. One or two have tried to change things, but it's really basically kept. And I think, you know, what I regret, that I didn't make the whole of Camberwell heritage at that time to protect it. You know, what I say is, because you see them being knocked down, it's just dreadful, and some big ugly thing going up. And I up and said, just try that in Paris and you'd be sent straight to the guillotine. I mean, the European cities know how to protect. You know, we all go to Europe and ooh and ah over to the wonderful old cities, and we come back here and destroy our own, right? You know that's true. So I totally agree with any heritage protection that you can bring in. Bring in as much as you can, you know. I'm pretty annoyed. Oh, well, I'm very pleased with you that you have refused. I've got a refusal in my hand dated the 16th of May to do with Sefton Place in Camberwell. Sefton Place runs off Broadway in the middle of a heritage area. And I'm very pleased to see that the council have refused it. It's not supported as a suitable replacement building. No, this is a heritage area. And so congratulations, Council, to the council officers for refusing this dreadful proposal in Sefton Place, Camberwell. And I think that we should be tougher on people who want to destroy our heritage, all right? In fact, you know, if I were on council now, I'd be pushing that the whole area be made heritage so that to stop all the dreadful development that we see happening, you know, changing the whole character of the place. We've got, you know, a wonderful suburb and we should protect it. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Ms Drost. Councillors, any questions?
No, they wouldn't dare.
There being none, Ms Drost, you may return to the gallery. Thank you. Apologies, Mr Greg Price, if you can come forward for your presentation, followed by Mrs Hazel Scott. And Mr Price, you're well known to the chamber. If we can commence with your name, suburb and your 3-minute presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. Greg Price from Glen Iris. Good evening. I want to cover a couple of themes in the report tonight. I dispute the claims of there being community consultation. Typically, what we face as ratepayers and users of these processes is just fact-checking. We need proper consultation. So I guess my first direct question is, why can't the community be consulted around policy formation rather than at these decision stages where we get to have a say? The document refers to the current Heritage Action Plan being scheduled to be reviewed and re-adopted in the 22-23 financial year. What I'd like to see is a community consultation review on the Heritage Action Plan rather than it just being done internally and then presented fait accompli at these kinds of sessions. What we're presented with tonight is not a really proposed policy, but it's a one-page diagram. It needs more detail and not just background information, because that's what you're voting. You're not voting on a full policy, you're voting on a flow diagram with very little detail. Policy should be public and findable. So there's a reference in there, another direct question. Where is the Section 29A demolition application decision-making process, which is referenced in the document? You can't search the council website and find these things. The process being proposed is convenient for the planning department only, but not ratepayers. So a question, another direct question, what happens regarding properties with issued permits for demolition or construction under this new proposal? Ratepayers and potential buyers need and want certainty in advance. We don't have designated change zones in Boroondara, so we need to protect our heritage, but people do want to go and build new houses or do redevelopments or whatever else, and there's no certainty in this. It costs a lot of money to get to the point of being able to put in, lodging permits and things like that, to go and get architects or, have contracts with builders. Properties will be placed on the possible heritage layer when the annual process commences, which is not transparency to the owners, because they're going to sit on basically yet another secret list before going to the possible heritage layer according to the document being proposed. So here are 5 direct requests. Owners to be notified when a nomination is lodged. The next one is public access to the heritage interest layer. I think it should be on the DELP database or the VicPlan database because multiple people want it. The annual assessment to start on a specific date. And the final 2, no new assessment of a property once a Section 29A or planning permit has been lodged, and no new assessment of a property to begin within 12 months of a property purchase. This gives people some certainty around their plans. And that's it, thanks.
Thank you, Mr Price. You've timed yourself very well. Thank you for that. Councillors, any questions of Mr Price? There being none, you may return to the gallery. Thank you for your presentation.
Thanks very much.
Our next presenter this evening is Mrs Hazel Scott, and after Ms Scott is Mr Darren Simcox. Thank you, Mrs Scott. If we can just commence with your name and your suburb and your 3-minute presentation. Thank you.
My name is Hazel Scott. I came to Burke Road, Camberwell in 1961, and I've lived in Rosebery Street, Hawthorn since 1991.
Thank you.
It was a shock at the end of last week to hear what is being proposed. This is not the first time a very short time frame has been given by council officers. And decisions which affect our way of living to such an extent should be widely canvassed to residents. Responsibility for sharing information that is understood by everybody rests with the person presenting the information. So I don't think that always happens. I find it disrespectful that we should be discounted in this manner. And as citizens, we must take some responsibility for our past apathy, once little involvement in the affairs of our neighbourhood. But this state of affairs is changing at a rapid pace. No longer can we stand back and see our community be stripped of its heritage, important history, and expect that council employees are able to make decisions without full consultation. We have great resources and skills in our community, particularly shown here tonight from some of the other presenters. And it is crazy if council doesn't take the opportunity to engage with Boroondara citizens and benefit in a shared responsibility to enhance our really beautiful municipality. There's a massive shift in people power as evidenced in our current, federal elections. So this must be recognised and respected in the important decisions before our council. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs Scott, for your presentation. Councillors, are there any questions? There being none, thank you for your presentation. Our next presenter is Mr Darren Simcox, and following Mr Simcox is Miss Christine Butler. Thank you. Mr Simcox, if we can commence with your name and your suburb and your 3-minute presentation.
Good evening, councillors. Thanks for the opportunity to speak. Darren Simcox, I'm a resident of Rosebery Street, Hawthorn East. I'm very concerned about the Community Heritage Nomination Process report that we only became aware of a few days ago. It's great that council are organising a nomination process, however, I do not agree with the process in the current form. It in itself has not been a transparent process, as there's been no community consultation. We think the report means that if a house has previously been assessed in a study, it cannot be nominated. However, we all know that houses were missed in some of the gap studies. Apparently, all residents of my street, Rosebery, were mailed a letter in relation to a gap study some years ago. Well, I'm not sure what happened to my letter, but maybe Australia Post got it wrong. But if you'd like to poll the street, you'll find there are very few people that were even aware of the gap study affected them at the time. The result being that we are now considered we're not considered a heritage protection, and we have spent hours upon hours, as well as thousands of dollars, through the community nomination process just to have our thoughts heard. Also, we think the report means if a house can be nominated, council will only accept evidence to criterion H, as we've heard, not A, B, C, D, E, F and G. I don't think under the Victorian Heritage Register criteria, the threshold guidelines, 6th of December 2012, stated on page 1, this criteria is intended to assist members of the community who are nominating a place or object for the inclusion in the VHR. Heritage assessors or advisors who assess the cultural heritage significance of places and objects, and statutory decision makers like yourself who determine whether places and objects should be included on the VHR. I don't think it's good practice or even legal to exclude any criteria. Council has the legislative obligations under the Planning Environment Act in 1987 and a statutory obligation to continuously identify and protect places of heritage significance through the Heritage Overlay. Under the Heritage Act 1995, there are similar democratic responsibilities. I believe that such constraints being put on the community nominations seriously undermine the legislation and impede the democratic process. Please remember that we're residents, not experts as you are, and that we're only trying to highlight what is important to us as a community. Further, can I ask why we are one of the few inner city councils who do not employ a heritage officer who could help us as residents and put some professionalism to it? And on the timing, Rosebery Street lost 4 Victorian cottages in a 2-year period. So I'm using it as an example because I know of it, and that's due to the lack of the overlay. So I think 10 years is a bit rich. I ask tonight that the committee do not adopt the community heritage nomination process in its current form, and a wider community is given a transparent consultation in the process. Thanks, councillors.
Thank you, Mr Simcox. Councillors, any questions? There being none. Thank you for your presentation, Mr Simcox. Our next presentation is from Miss Christine Butler, and following Miss Butler, Mr Domenico Boffa.
I actually have all my points have been already covered, so I'll let the next person go.
Wonderful.
I definitely am not in favour of your changes.
Thank you, Miss Butler, for alerting me to that. So our next presenter is Mr Domenico Boffa. If you can come forward, please. And following Mr Boffa, Miss Nicole Allen. Thank you, Mr Boffa. If we can commence with your name, suburb and 3-minute presentation. Thank you.
Good evening. My name's Domenico Boffa and I live in Rosebery Street, Hawthorn. Tonight I'm reading this on behalf of Nerida Meriden, a Camberwell resident and a member of the BHGAP. Hello, councillors and officers. Thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight. I'm very concerned about the Community Heritage Nomination Process report that we only became aware a few days ago. It is welcome that the council are organising a nomination process. However, I do not agree that this process in its current form. It has no transparency process as there has been no community consultation. We think the report means if a house has previously been assessed in a study, then it cannot be nominated. However, we all know that houses were missed in the gap studies due to community nominations that have been processed. Also, we think the report means that if your house can be nominated, council will only accept evidence relating to only criteria H. Why not criteria A, B, C, D, E, F and G? Why only H? The recommendation not to pursue heritage protection for standalone contributory houses is disappointing. Council needs to fight for change to an inadequate state government planning regulation. Councils have a statutory obligation to continually identify, protect places of heritage significance through the heritage overlay. Our heritage stock has been bulldozed weekly. Do you know that in 2021, Boroondara has the second highest number of demolitions in Metro Melbourne? Over 2,329 properties demolished since 2016. It's a big issue for a lot of people. The report does not mention how the council will let the community know exactly what houses are flagged for demolition. Will it be promoted on the council website? Will there be an online demolition register that lists applicants such as the planning register? I ask tonight that the committee do not adopt the community heritage nomination process in its current form and the wider community given transparency consultation in the process. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Boffa, for your presentation. Councillors, are there any questions of Mr Boffa? There being none, thank you. You may return to the gallery.
Thank you.
Our next presenter is Ms Nicole Allen, and following Ms Allen, we have Ms Joanne Fenton. Thank you, Ms Allen. If we can commence with your name, suburb and your 3-minute presentation.
Hi, Nikki Allen, Fairfield Avenue, Camberwell. And some of you may know me from being the annoying person who wanted Trumper Street to be protected, and unfortunately we were unsuccessful with that. It strikes me today, I actually came in to object against the nomination whereby we can't renominate a place if it's already been rejected. And it made me think, I know it's been covered by other people, but it made me think, I think we're going about this the wrong way. Why are we fighting to protect places? Why do the people who are demolishing places not have to fight to demolish it? Why can't we protect everything over a certain amount of, over a certain amount, I know 40 years, 30 years old, and then make the people who are demolishing it have to fight to demolish it and prove to us that there are no heritage features or categories that it meets. I mean, it seems to be that everybody wants to think the properties to be protected, and we're all fighting to have them protected, but the people who are demolishing them don't have to prove anything at all. So why can't we change around the process? Instead of having us fighting for our heritage, have those people say, well, we think it can be demolished because it does not meet any of the criteria that heritage shows. And I think that it would save a lot of money and a lot of the pain and stress that's going on in this room to have us, have our heritage protected, and those people who want to make money out of demolishing a place and building 2 or 3 properties on the one site have to pay the price for that.
Thank you, Ms Allen. There are no questions from councillors. You may return to the gallery. Thank you. Our next presenter this evening is Ms Joanne Fenton. Thank you, Ms Fenton.
Before I sit down, I provided USB stick box up there. Okay, fine.
I think, Ms Fenton, all councillors have received your photograph. If we can just commence with your name, suburb and your 3-minute presentation. Thank you.
Joanne Fenton, Hawthorn East. I have concerns with the proposed new process. What actually is perceived as heritage can be very subjective, and hence the outcome. A fine example of this subjectivity comes from my experience with number 9 Auburn Grove, which you have up there. In the 1992 Hawthorn Heritage Study, undertaken by Meredith Gould, she did not identify number 9 as a heritage home. Ms Gould made a mistake in her evaluation. This, as I said, that what I've provided you is certainly a very fine example of a fabric intact Italianate villa, 1880s. Becoming aware of its lack of heritage protection led to my efforts in 2016 to 17 to ensure, along with council officers, that this property obtained its heritage classification as significant. I have given this example to you as I'm most concerned, actually extremely concerned, that if you agree to the use of this new nomination process, that another one of these will arise and there is no provision that such a property will obtain heritage protection. For example, you will rely on past assessments as being correct assessments. Grasmere's initial assessment was not correct. Its sister Italianate villa at number 14, Auburn Grove, got a tick for significance from Miss Gould. Grasmere, as you see up there, did not. Fortunately, with time and effort by myself and council, Grasmere now has a significant heritage status. So, based on what I have said, the phrase on page 140, at the final paragraph, second line, first dot point, it needs to be deleted. It will just not work. It's just placing too much reliance on past assessments as being correct assessments. It is also relying on the assumption of there being no human error or mistakes in planning assessments. If this component is left in, there will be no chance for council or the community to save heritage homes that have been overlooked or not correctly assessed. Also, I ask if this process, is it democratic, fair and correct for council to shut this process down? So in closing, I urge and ask that you do not endorse the officer's recommendation. To assist further in your decision-making here, I draw your attention to theme 4 of the Burundara Community Plan Strategic Objective, which is protect the heritage and respect the character of Burundara while facilitating appropriate, well-designed development. This is the appropriate policy framework for you to consider here tonight in your decision-making. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Fenton, and spot on timing. Councillors, are there any questions of Ms Fenton? There being none.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Our next presenter is Ms Helen Slee, if you can come forward. And after Ms Slee, it is Ms Robin Kelly. And if we can just commence with your name, suburb and your 3-minute presentation.
Thank you, Chair. And my name is Helen Slee and I live in Camberwell. Thank you. Excuse me. I have a house that's been protected since 1990s. I was not consulted. I don't really see why owners have to be consulted. I'll just start with that. I was not, and I don't mind that. I have been defending heritage in Camberwell since 1998. I've had a lot of experience with planners, councillors, etc. I haven't had as much success as I'd like. Drawing on my experience, I'm sorry, but I do not believe the planning department supports heritage in a meaningful way. It's 25 years almost of experience. It does not give certainty or security to our heritage. It seems to favour the developers. The big urban design companies are well known here. They boast on their websites that they have relationships with, they don't mention Burundara.
Ms Lee, if I could just direct you to present with regards to the officer's report rather than...
Well, this is in tying in with it, because here is the example...
I'd urge for you to caution away from making accusations about officers.
Okay, all right. Well, I will say that this is an example tonight that we're fighting heritage that I have been fighting since 1998. So here is that example, heritage under threat. Yet again, why is it never properly fixed? That's the proper question, I suppose. So I would suggest that one of the issues is the planning department relies heavily on heritage advice. They use that in all of their reports, which are public documents. So the question about the heritage advisors, in my opinion, is they're choosing ones that are rather conflicted sometimes. And I was told when I made an inquiry about a property a few years ago, that council has a hard time finding advisors who are prepared to take on the job of defending the heritage. So perhaps we need to look harder for truly independent advisors who are not attached to the big companies who do big jobs for urban design companies, for example. They are out there. Victoria must have them, I believe. One of the things about giving permits for removing protection is that it's open for demolition. And what happens with demolition is every tree is at risk of getting lost. And the council promotes its green support online. But every week, there's clear felling of every tree on properties to do the big development. So you can't have it both ways. So I really wish council would consider the green aspect of the environment and shade trees, etc., as well as properties being bulldozed and go to landfill. That's another environmental issue, hasn't been mentioned. So finally, I just want to ask if council could consider publicly placing historical signs around our precinct that promotes these beautiful precincts that you talk about on the website. Newcomers come in, they get educated, they get supportive. We don't have a problem. That's my suggestion.
Thank you, Ms Lee, for your presentation. Councillors, are there any questions of Ms Lee? There being none, thank you for your presentation. Our next presenter is Ms Robin Kelly. Thank you, Ms Kelly. If we can commence with your name and your suburb, and I do believe you've circulated a...
Can I have photo 2 up first, please?
Thank you. So if we can commence with, once that's in focus, if we can commence with your name, suburb and your 3-minute presentation. Thank you, Ms Kelly.
Thank you. My name is Robin Kelly and I'm at Kirrieep Road, 2A Kirrieep Road, Balwyn. I think I should be down, I should have ticked the box more of unsure because I was told about this sort of at the last minute and I hardly see anybody here that I know, and so many more people should have been informed about this very important meeting. So why I ticked it is that I am all for heritage to be improved so much because of what happened with this wonderful farmhouse here, Seven Oaks Farm at 7 Oak Street, which I've been fighting with Mary Dross for the last 8 years to make sure it would never be demolished. In the Balwyn Historical Society, we had the owner, had it in beautiful condition inside and out. Mary and I met a couple 5 years ago outside Edgar's Real Estate that were prepared to totally restore it. They were members of the family and it was passed into them at 4.3 million. And so please don't give up hope that there will be somebody that will want to restore something eventually. Don't give up. It is gone. It was demolished last July and it is gone. 7 Oaks Farm from 7 Oak Street with Knott Street, with Freeman Street, all connected with the famous owner back in the 1890s. Please don't think before you do something like this again. Now, I would like to say, yes, more heritage experts, please, to help, and we really do want that, that's for sure. Now, I'd like to go to the next photograph, please, which is something that is up for auction at the moment, and I want to put this to council. This is probably one of the oldest Warrandyte stone farmhouses in Melbourne. It's 1856, 20 years after John Batman. It's had 26 owners in the last, since its birth. Mr. Roberts built it in 1856 and it occupied 69 acres on the hilltop there at Doncaster Tram Terminus, 192 Doncaster Road, just next to Balwyn Road, behind a high fence. So Doncaster Historical Society, I go to meetings there at Schramm's Cottage, also built out of a similar stone, and owned by the Manningham Council. Now, I'm putting it to our council tonight because of what is happening with this beautiful little farmhouse. It was up for sale in December. I stood up and said, is it heritage protected? They said, we don't know, the auctioneer said. And we'd already talked about it before the auction, so it got passed in and very violent towards me. Then it was put up again in April and it was sold to Chinese people that didn't speak English. Then the sold sign was taken off it a couple of weeks ago. So now it is up for sale again to about $1.5 million. This unique 1856 farmhouse should be bought by our council. You could have school tours there, it can have a spotlight on it, have the fence taken down, and it's right there in a prominent
this is
spot.
just not relevant
So
to
I
the
want
note.
to put that to council.
Sorry, Ms Kelly, I'll just deal with Councillor Parks. Oh, I've muted myself. Ms Kelly, that's the conclusion of your presentation? I think that your 3 minutes is up, Ms Kelly. Thank you. Councillors, are there any questions of Ms Kelly? Councillor Parker, do note your light's still on. Councillor Sinfield.
Thank you, Chair. Ms Kelly, you said more heritage experts, please. I'm wondering where you would like them placed, or are you talking about the requirement for a heritage report to be provided upon community nomination of a property? Are you able to tell me what you meant by more heritage experts, please?
Can you turn it on? Thank you. Yes, I would like there to be a permanent heritage person at council, for sure. Very much so. We are so lucky to have these marvellous, and Laurie Butner to get 2,000 shops and houses in Canterbury, and everyone said, oh, it'll affect the values. It didn't. Look at the values in Canterbury. 2,000 houses with the heritage overlay, which I was in.
Ms Kelly, I believe you've answered the question of...
The Mailing Precinct Protection Group.
Ms Kelly,
Hurrah.
Ms Kelly, you've answered the question of Councillor Sinfield. Thank you for that. Are there any further questions of councillors? There being none, Ms Kelly, you may return to the gallery. Thank you. Our last presenter this evening to come forward is Miss Susan Horn. Thank you, Ms Horn.
For the opportunity to present.
Thank you. If you can just commence with your name and your suburb and your 3-minute presentation. Thank you.
So I'm Suzanne Horn. I also live in Wattle Road in Hawthorn. Sorry, am I clear with the mask on?
That's fine.
I have recently been involved in a planning process that will result in a heritage building being demolished next month. In relation to this nomination process, I'd like to suggest that I think I said I was uncertain. I, in fact, probably don't suggest that this process should be supported. I think you can do better. The process doesn't talk about precinct nomination. So whilst the report mentions precinct nomination, there's no identification of how you would nominate precinct within the actual process that you're asked to approve. That process, as many others have noted, as soon as one property has been assessed previously, it's unclear to me how you would then include it in consideration of a precinct. So that's the question that I think I'm adding to the comments from others this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Horn, for your presentation. And there appears to be no questions from councillors, so you may return to the gallery. Thank you. And just like to thank the gallery for persevering through those presentations. So we'll turn to matters arising. Mr Wilson.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Sorry, I'm just going through my notes to make sure that I cover everything off. So there's a few consistent themes obviously coming through in tonight's presentations, and I'll touch upon a few of those. Obviously concern with regards to the limitation on criterion H for places that had previously been assessed or have undergone the amendment process and had a negative decision through that amendment process, either by council or the panel or the Minister for Planning. As I explained in my introduction, the limitation on that was based on the lack of visibility of that going into the field, and that's why that was considered to be an appropriate response. Again, there was a lot of reference to places being missed as part of the gap study, places that as part of the gap study that were not assessed, they can still be considered. So if something was missed, then that wasn't assessed, and there is ability for that to be assessed for any of the criteria. I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding of the process here. Yes. Secondly, the comments around consultation. This is a proposal for a council process. This is not a policy position. It doesn't affect how council would apply the heritage overlay to individual properties. It doesn't make decisions about individual properties, and therefore there was no community consultation on the process. Community groups and historical societies was notified last week. Yes, not within the 10 days that council would normally undertake when we have a planning scheme amendment or a matter of policy or a strategy, but it's within the 48 hours that are required under the Local Government Act for notification to allow residents to be involved in the process.
Point of order, Gallery, please. I've asked this once before. We need to hear from the officers, and then there will be an opportunity for councillors to ask questions of the officers. So councillors do need to hear what the officers are saying at this time.
There are also many individual places mentioned: 76 Wattle Road, Berkeley Street, Seven Oaks, Auburn Grove. I'm not going to comment on each of those individually. I think there's a lot of history with each of those properties that, you know, the important bit is to understand that there are always individual circumstances to an individual property and how it might have ended up or not ended up in the heritage overlay. And 14 Seven Oaks, there were lots of assessments, lots of decisions, lots of opportunities for the community to be involved in that process, even if it didn't end up in the heritage overlay and has now unfortunately been demolished. There were some comments around the Heritage Act, and in particular the time limit by Mr. Thorne. So the Heritage Act is not relevant for the consideration of local heritage properties. The Heritage Act is there to manage places of state significance and properties that are on the Victorian Heritage Register. So it's not actually a decision framework for council around which properties should be in the heritage overlay and which are not. That is governed by the Planning and Environment Act and the relevant practice notes issued by the Victorian government. Now, there were some follow-up questions as to what is an appropriate time frame, and that's probably for the experts to determine as to whether it's 5 years, 10 years, but it's certainly not a relevant consideration within the framework that council, as the planning authority, has to consider. Mr. Price brought up the HAP, a review of the Heritage Action Plan. The Heritage Action Plan was last adopted when Council commenced the municipal-wide heritage gap study, which will come to a conclusion next week when the Glen Iris Heritage Gap Study Amendment is going to Council for final adoption. Now, a review of the HAP is scheduled for next financial year. That process will include community consultation. There seems to be an assumption that there will be no consultation on that, but there will be consultation on that. And there will be opportunity for the community to have their say on that. There were also, and forgive me, I probably couldn't type quick enough. There were various suggestions there that no assessments of heritage of places be undertaken when a Section 29A has been lodged. Or that no assessments to be undertaken within 12 months of land being sold or purchased. Those are not really relevant considerations in the framework that we're working with that are governed under the Building Act, the Building Regulations, and the Planning and Environment Act. It's not implementable within the current legislative framework that we have. The same goes for, there were comments around that we should stop or prevent demolition of properties of a certain age and that we should impose additional requirements for people to be able to demolish a property. Council has to act within the legislative framework that exists in Victoria. And the legislative framework that we have clearly sets out when we can consent to demolition or have to consent to demolition, and when we have a right or the ability to refuse consent or suspend consent to demolition. We cannot act outside our statutory obligations and powers. So there was a comment at the end around the uncertainty with regards to precincts.
Mr Wilmson, if I could just pause you for a second. Councillor Park.
Oh, sorry, no, just when the office is finished.
Thank you, Councillor Park. Please, Mr Wilmson.
Thank you, Mr Chair. The process refers to place. Under the framework, a place includes both an individual property and a precinct. For heritage purposes under the heritage overlay, a precinct is a place, whether that nominates 50 or 500 properties within that precinct. That's why it is just referred to as place rather than precinct as or individual places. There's certainly no intention to prevent denomination of precincts, be that an individual street or part of a street or more than one street. The process will allow for that. And then the last one, that this would prevent council from pursuing more heritage. That's certainly not the case. Council has the ability through its annual budget process to provide funding for officers and the strategic planning team to engage consultants to do additional heritage studies. And that could be either thematic or that could be linked to a particular geographical location within the municipality. That is still open to council to do, and this process won't stop. That this is there to allow the community to have a process where they can nominate, because as was mentioned, there is no process for that at the moment, and it's being done in an ad hoc manner and uncontrolled. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr Wilmson. I do note that Councillor Park has his light on.
Chair, I'd just like to move an adjournment for 10 minutes.
Thank you. Is 10 minutes sufficient, Councillor Park?
I believe it would be. Yeah.
Do I have a seconder for that? I'm just looking down the list. Councillor Stavrou? No?
Sure.
Yeah, as an adjournment? Okay, I'll put that motion to the vote. All those in favour? I declare that carried. Just for the benefit of the gallery, councillors have moved a motion to adjourn to just discuss a few items. I'd ask that the gallery doesn't approach councillors during this point in time. If that is the case, we've got our governance to escort you into the air lobby. You're more than welcome to sit there. Please don't approach councillors. 10 minutes. Thanks, Councillor Park. Councillors, I'm in search of a motion to resume the meeting.
So moved.
So seconded.
And seconded, moved Councillor Park, seconded Councillor Sinfield. I'll put that motion to the vote. All those in favour? I declare that carried unanimously. So, councillors, we're going to return to questions of officers, and I note Councillor Sinfield has her light on.
Thank you, Chair. I do have a couple of questions, but I'd also like to foreshadow a motion.
Thank you, Councillor Sinfield. That is noted. If you can proceed with your questions.
Thank you. And through you to officers, I'm curious about what benchmarking may have been done with like councils.
We didn't contact any other councils about what community heritage nomination process they've got in place or don't have in place.
Thank you. I'm wondering also if this community heritage nomination process has at all been reviewed by our lawyers as far as the suggestion earlier that we are limiting any human rights or other rights compared with the HERCON criteria?
Through you, Mr. Chair, no legal advice has been sought.
Thank you. In relation to matters arising, it was mentioned that a time frame for reviewing properties that had previously been assessed was not relevant. I'm wondering if officers might be able to explain a little bit about why such a time frame, be it 5 years or 10 years or 3 years, wouldn't be relevant.
Through you, Mr. Chair. The comment was in relation to the applicability of the Heritage Act, not the concept of a time limitation of when council might think it's appropriate to reconsider an application after a decision had been made through an earlier process. That was really all it's meant. Whether that is 5 years or 10 years or 15 years, that's the question, if that's where council wants to go.
Sure, thank you. And finally, I'm wondering why this, I want to call it a policy, but it's listed here as a process. The Community Heritage Nomination Process paper, as we've received it, has not previously gone for community consultation prior to proposed or recommendation for adoption.
Because officers considered it a process, and we didn't think it was necessary to undertake the community consultation on a council process because it's not a policy position.
I think that ends my questions. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Sinfield. I note that there are a number of other questions of councillors. Councillor Hollingsworth, Councillor Stavrou and Councillor Park, in that order, and Councillor Franco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Wilmot, I just wanted to ask, at the moment we don't have a formal or official process for heritage nomination, but if this officer recommendation was not supported this evening, would, when I say status quo, remain the same? At the moment, community can put forward nominations. I presume they would be able to do so. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Right, thank you. And just my second question, with your indulgence, the attachment A, which is the human heritage nomination process outlined in a map, in theory, is the process what we're doing at the moment the same as this, but this at the second criteria has preliminary review by officers and then a CLAD basically prohibiting certain elements of criteria. In theory, what we're doing at the moment is the same, is that correct, but without the CLAD beside it?
Yes, just in an ad hoc manner where every nomination that is lodged has to be considered and will require the resources allocated to it and a heritage consultant to be involved. And the process is sought to provide a process and some boundaries around that.
Right, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hollingsworth. Councillor Stavrou.
Thank you, Chair. I guess one question, you may have answered it before, Mr. Wilson, but I may not have understood it. If a property has not been reviewed as part of one of our gap studies, can that property under this process still be nominated by the public?
Yes.
Thank you. The other question I have is that under the current process as proposed, and it goes to the question I think that a lot of our residents coming to the microphone perhaps wanted to focus on, and that's a sort of certain amount of fairness. And if, let's say, a property was previously considered, and I'm looking now at the eligibility criteria, the first one, and it says not previously adequately assessed. Now, the word adequately immediately brings to mind not adequately too. Would that, and an appropriate interpretation of that, mean that if the public can bring information under the other criteria, apart from criterion H, that were not adequately assessed by any of the heritage consultants that we had engaged, could that mean that a new application be put to council under these new criteria that perhaps demonstrably shows that something was missed in a previous assessment?
So the question is if something was not adequately assessed?
Apologies, I had to think about that question. I wasn't sure I quite understood. But yes, so officers in that instance would have to satisfy themselves that those other criteria had in actual fact, or the information had in actual fact not been considered as part of that previous assessment.
Okay. May I ask a third question with your indulgence? Then would it be prudent to actually thematise that a little bit more so that the community can get a sense that there is an avenue for the other criteria if a mistake, because we're not infallible, that's been demonstrably said to us multiple times, if a mistake has been made, to thematise the adequateness and that there is an avenue under this process to actually bring something back to council if information has been put or found or demonstrably showed it wasn't considered appropriately.
Yes, and I think my response earlier that provides that ability goes to that point and kind of confirms that, yes.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I'm comfortable with that.
Thank you, Councillor Stavrou. The questions of officers, questions of councillors here in order are Councillor Park, Councillor Addis, Councillor Franco and Councillor Bigger. Councillor Park.
Thank you, Chair. I think the answer to Councillor Sinfield's last question was that public consultation was deemed unnecessary because this is a process rather than a policy. Is that correct? So, what is it about policies versus processes that would enliven the need to seek consultation?
Mr. Walker.
Through yourself, Chair. I think the important point about a policy or strategy is it is setting a direction for the council around its decisions and around its actions to implement that particular direction that's been set by the council. So it's actually about the pointer and direction that a policy or strategy is focused on. A process is simply about the mechanics of dealing with submissions, administration and the like associated with that.
So then the true characterisation of this document would be as a policy rather than a process, would it not?
Through yourself, Chair, no, I don't believe so. This is about
just applying your answer. I was just applying your answer to what's before us. Doesn't this actually do pretty much everything that you said a policy does?
This is not implementing a strategic direction around heritage. That would be dealt with elsewhere.
Right. This document could just as easily be before us as a policy, could it not?
In a broader sense, you could view it that way. Yeah, but
the approach here of having council adopt a process or a process map, I don't recall having seen that done before. Is this something new, or am I just being forgetful?
Again, through yourself, Chair, I understand that there have been similar sorts of processes put in place before. The Section 29A process for dealing with demolitions under the Building Act would be one of those examples of a process being put in place of how to deal with that, the mechanics of how to deal with that when that situation arises.
And my final question, Chair, given what we now know, do you think that it was we could have gone about consulting in a better way, or at all, given the reaction?
I'm not sure if officers want to answer that question. I think that's determined by the officers.
Well, let me phrase it. Perhaps that was clumsily phrased. Why is this document that clearly impacts on members of the public not worthy of consultation?
Mr. Chairman, can I just speak for a moment? I think this question's been answered. The staff clearly looked at this as a process, not as a policy. That's been explained by Mr. Walker. If councillors want to take a view that it should be viewed differently, that's a matter for them. We don't make judgments about the advice we provide based on what the community might think about that advice. Our job is to give technical advice to council, which is what this is, and councillors are perfectly entitled to take a completely different view in relation to that advice. But that's not an appropriate question for any officer to be asked. It's up to councillors to determine whether or not they believe that advice ought not be supported.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll say more about that during debate.
Thank you, Councillor Part. Councillor Addis, followed by Councillor Franco, Councillor Bigger. Councillor Addis.
Thanks very much, Chair. Councillor Stavrou, I think, asked my question, but I just want to clarify a couple of things and then follow it up with another question. So what I'm understanding is that the key eligibility criteria would allow new information, mistakes and missing information to provide a trigger for reassessment, essentially.
In simple terms, yeah. So officers will take care or will ensure that heritage consultants consider the matter appropriately. And if there was an error, and we have examples, I actually think 9 Auburn Grove, that actually goes back to an error that was made at the time, and that was rectified through that process, for that to be reconsidered, yes.
Thank you. So clearly I've got my ideas about why we're doing this, and I sort of feel that the community doesn't understand why we're doing it and whether there could be some clarification, because it seems to me what we're saying is no, all of that stuff's taken care of within this, but there must be something else that motivates us to bring this forward. And I'm happy to talk about that when we get to debate, but I'd be interested to hear officers' view.
The main driver from officers' perspective is to provide a process for something that currently and for the last few years hasn't had a process associated with it. Having an adopted process, we know from experience, with the Section 29A process in particular, is extremely helpful because it provides clarity and certainty. That hasn't always been the case with this process, and officers are made to make judgment calls on what is reconsidered and what is not reconsidered, and this process is intended to address that.
Thanks very much, Chair. That was helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Addis. Councillor Franco.
Thank you, Chair. Is there any urgency in relation to the current proposal, in your view?
there's no statutory timeframe or obligation for council to adopt the process. So no.
Given this, what's your view, or might this not be initially better considered as part of the future heritage action plan as a discussion point and or potential action item as part of such a policy which would go out for public consultation?
It could, but it doesn't have to. And the longer, the HAP review is happening next financial year, so there'll be a substantial period of time when officers will still have to continue to administer the ad hoc process that we have been dealing with for the last few years and all the implications that come with that.
In relation to notifying property owners, this is an issue that's come up this evening, does the current draft process before us envisage any specific timeframes as to when property owners would be notified? I can see it referenced, but there's no absolutely clear guidance. I'm curious what's the view underlying this.
So that is different depending on whether the property is under immediate threat of demolition or not. Properties that are under immediate threat of demolition and where that is demonstrated through the nomination, those properties obviously will get notified straight away, and council has to notify them of the decision in response to the Section 29A within 15 business days anyway. So the heritage assessment has to be undertaken within that period of time, and then a decision is communicated to the applicant of that Section 29A application immediately. With the other ones that are not under immediate threat, they'll be added to a list. We haven't formed the view on whether those properties will then, that list of properties will be taken after 3 months, 6 months, 9 months or 12 months. I suppose that depends a little bit on the extent of the number of properties that are on that list, the perceived urgency around that, but obviously officers will take any guidance that the councils or views that councils might have on what an appropriate timeframe might be to commence that assessment and when to notify residents that they've been added to that list for further investigation.
You've preempted my following question in a way, Mr. Wilson. The reference to the possible heritage layer in the current draft, to the best of my knowledge, that's not something that's publicly defined or discussed in any council or publicly accessible council document. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So it's a bit of a challenge potentially for people reading a reference to a potential heritage layer and seeking any information other than coming to council on a case-by-case basis and asking that information. That's correct, isn't it?
Well, yeah, that information is not publicly accessible unless we write to the property owner to tell them that they have been included on that list and what the consequences or what's associated with being on that list, what that means for them.
And look, a final question. Have council officers given any consideration to public access to that list, not simply to an eventual to the property owner and to the nominator, but publicly? And I go back to the reason for asking this is the example of 32 Corby Street, where the property was sold and a prospective, the owner and the nominator were all aware, but the new purchaser, presumably in their due diligence, didn't realise that the property was on a potential heritage layer. So I wonder, have we given any thought to that issue?
So making a list public of places on the register is not something that we have considered in the sense of that would be a good idea. We think that there could be potential implications with regards to privacy, 32 Corby Street being a very good example where the owner was very upset that other people knew that their property was being investigated for heritage significance, that's not on the cards at the moment. We certainly haven't built that into the process at this point in time. Scott?
Thank you.
Through yourself, Chair, if I just add to that, the risk as well for council is if it does make that public, but ultimately there is nothing to pursue in terms of heritage for that property, council has already preempted that by making that publicly available, and that information at that time may have implications on that particular property and that property owner. So there's swings and roundabouts, there's pros and cons of both processes, but there's implications of doing that and then deciding for very good reason not to pursue heritage on that particular property.
Councillor Frankie, you might seek to raise that as a general business item for a later CB&D. Councillor Bigger.
Yep, thank you very much. I just have one remaining question that hasn't been covered. So I suppose I still want to try to understand the problem that we're trying to solve here, really. I think it's about efficiency, it seems like, or about improving efficiency, if that's correct. That's you're looking like you want to answer that. Is that not right?
If that's a question, there's a couple of aspects of it. It is absolutely about efficiency in the way that we approach heritage and heritage nominations. And there's two real key components here that we're talking about. Firstly, it's about how often and how frequently we have to go back and revisit a property when it has already gone through a process. So that's the first issue that we're grappling with this community heritage nomination process, because that takes quite significant resources. And it's not just resources for council, it's actually community resources and community effort that goes into that. So that's the first issue that we're grappling with. Then the second issue that we're grappling with is where we think that there might still be some heritage in different properties. It's the ad hoc nature at the moment that we're dealing with those heritage situations and heritage nominations individually, and they have to run their own amendment process, and that happens throughout the year. The running and processing of an amendment is very resource intensive, and what this second part does is enables us to collect up all those properties where we feel there is heritage and roll them into one single amendment process once a year, which makes it much more efficient.
Yes,
so
but if I can just...
The two components there are what this is actually trying to manage.
Yes, and I understand. So if I can just comment on that point, though, presumably the eligibility criteria that have been introduced in this are not necessary to do that second step, meaning we could be doing that right now. We could be saying right now, as long as there's not a demolition order pending on this, we're just going to group all these together, all the community nominations, and we'll look at them all at once. And we could still do that even without the proposed additional eligibility criteria. Is that not correct?
Through yourself, Chair, that's correct. You could have either one of those and have a process that focuses on just one of those things.
Yes, and
it would get you so far, but wouldn't get you...
Yes, I realise you're trying to do two different things. All I'm saying is that second piece is not dependent on the first piece to be achieved. We could still do that second piece, adopt that and say that's fine, but without potentially the eligibility criteria. And I'm going to a question, and that is, so it seems to me that we're not trying to protect fewer places. It's that we don't want to waste resources on properties which we believe will never end up protected. And so my question is whether or not we have any data about whether community nominations are less likely, historically, to end up protected than non-community nominations, because it just seems like that's an important factor, because it could be that community nominations are actually more likely to end up That may not be the case, but it's worth knowing, right?
I might jump in here through, Mr. Chair. So we don't have any specific data to look at the number of properties that have been nominated by the community compared and how successful they were compared to the ones that were assessed through the GAP study or other heritage assessments, say for Baldwin or outside the GAP study. We have examples where the community nomination did not result in a success with getting a heritage overlay over them, and 1 Coolangatta Road is one example, 1207 Burke Road is another example. There are also a number of other nominations that we received on an ad hoc basis that officers responded to that never made it to the chamber, where the consultant's advice was no, they don't meet the criteria. And we have quite a 5 Trumper Street is another one. We have a number of projects on the go at the moment, Rosebery, Wattle, Harcourt, where we don't know what the success is going to be because we're still in the process.
Yes, I understand. I just think it's useful to not have us going on anecdotal information. Thank you.
Take that on note. Councillor Gold.
Thank you. Look, I'm a great supporter of these diagrams, but in this case, I feel there's some information missing in between, and it needs some explanation. And picking up from Councillor Stavro's question on not previously adequately assessed, under the preliminary review by officers, you've got 3 dot points. Do each of those dot points have to be met to move on to the next stage or make a decision on the next stage, or not? Can you, in fact, succeed in any one of them? So, for instance, if it is found that there's certain items about a property that haven't been properly assessed previously here too, that gets you through item 1, but perchance it had then gone on to council, panel and or minister and was knocked out, or criterion is outside H, would dot point 2 or 3 knock it out? So does it need to meet all criteria or only 1 or 2? I'm not clear on that. And that's where I think some further explanation is probably required.
Yeah. So the 3rd dot point really only comes into effect if 1 and 2 criteria are not met. So in that regard, you are correct that the diagram probably needs to be clarified in that regard, where it says, and this is probably better described in the report, where a place has previously been adequately assessed and where it's, and usually, often it results in amendment, and where it has gone through a process that not necessarily lead into each other. So, for example, you cannot always meet the 1st and the 2nd dot point at the same time because something might already be pushed out through the assessment process. It'll never get to number 2, if you understand what I mean, from a process perspective. So it's not that you have to meet all of them at the same time. There are scenarios where you cannot meet 1 and 2 at the same time anyway. And number 3 is only there as a clarifier under what circumstances you might also consider a place that's been kicked out under any of the previous dot points. I hope that's clear.
So just picking up in Councillor Addis's point, therefore dot point, the 1st and 2nd dot point is really what we do now. So if we find something comes in and we've adequately assessed it?
Yes, in the broadest sense, that's what we do when an assessment comes in, yes. When a nomination comes in, and that's what we have been doing, yes.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gold. I just have a couple of questions myself. If Council was of the mind to adopt the officer's recommendation practical application, would it allow for the consideration of an equivalent of Wattle Road in its current circumstance and also Rosebery Street? And is there a difference and how it would be applied?
Yes, under potential circumstances, it depends on officers satisfying themselves that the assessment that was undertaken as part of the gap study was already adequately considered the heritage significance or value of the place. If through the work that the consultants have undertaken, it can be demonstrated that they already did some historical research, they already did inquire, they already did an assessment, and they knocked it out at that point, then the likelihood of that doesn't qualify. But where there's a scenario where it wasn't really considered, and they're not able to demonstrate that they have considered it, then that will be eligible for review.
Just a further question. If community nominations came unqualified from the community versus by a heritage consultant, does that provide any different weighting?
Certainly to officers having even if it is a preliminary assessment from a heritage consultant that provides substance to the nomination and under which criteria might be met, that's extremely helpful for officers in terms of determining whether it is worthy of further investigation or not.
So it has a higher weighting to assist officers. Okay, thank you. Councillor Park?
If I could just ask supplementary, if council was of the view that this belongs in a policy document, would the Heritage Action Plan be the appropriate document?
That depends on how the Heritage Action Plan is drafted in the future and whether it remains a Heritage Action Plan or whether it actually turns into, say, a heritage strategy. The Heritage Action Plan, as it was adopted in 2016, is a very, as its title suggests, an action-focused document that identifies or prioritizes heritage assessments and all the very high priority actions relate to the completion of the heritage gap study. So I think as the Heritage Action Plan is at the moment, that's not a policy document, and so it wouldn't be appropriate in that, but that doesn't mean that the Heritage Action Plan can't take a different form in its next iteration that might deal with this matter.
And finally, that plan is overdue for review by more than a year, is that the case?
It was slated to be reviewed when the gap study completes. Obviously, the gap study has taken longer than was initially planned, so therefore the review is slated now with the gap study completing.
Okay, it's just the copy I have says it's 5 years after adoption.
On that basis, it will be 1 year out of date, and that's scheduled for on the work program for next financial year.
Thank you.
If I may, Councillor Stavrou, just to follow up on Councillor Parks, if Council were to adopt tonight and review a strategy in the future, would what we adopt tonight lapse with the new strategy?
Not necessarily, no, unless there's a formal decision for that to happen. There's obviously the opportunity if some kind of strategy in the future comes up with a different idea, a different process, then that would have to be readopted, but it's not an automatic process.
Thank you. Councillor Stavrou, and do any other councillors have any further questions? Okay, Councillor Stavrou.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Councillor Park's question prompted a thought in me just to clarify something, pretty much lack of knowledge here. Excuse me. Do we currently have a heritage policy?
As in a planning policy?
Yes.
Yes.
Would that be, excuse me, would that be the right place for this process to actually be an adjunct to?
No. Because that's a planning policy to assess and determine planning permit applications under the planning scheme. This is not that.
Right.
This is a different process. This is a process that happens prior to a property being included in a heritage overlay or the decision around that. So this is about heritage identification, not about heritage management. The local heritage policy in the planning scheme is about heritage management.
Thank you.
I believe, Councillor Sinfield, you don't have a question. You foreshadowed a motion. Can we, have you got something prepared that the officers can put on the screen?
Yes, I believe Ms Manu has that ready for us.
If you could, just for the benefit of the gallery, because they would not have seen this, just talk through this and then I'll be in search of a seconder.
Certainly. I'll try and speak to it without
If you can just run through your motion.
editorialising it. I propose that the Urban Planning Delegated Committee resolve to defer consideration of this item to a future meeting in order for the committee to consider the following, including a time frame for reconsideration of properties, including eligibility criteria beyond criterion H, allowing any exceptional circumstances to be considered by the Director of Urban Living, receiving community feedback on the community heritage nomination process after the trial period, review the extent of information required as part of a community heritage nomination, seeking clarity on how and when affected property owners are notified. That is my motion.
Thank you, Councillor Sinfield, and I'm in search of a seconder. Is that you, Councillor Bigger?
Yes, I'm happy to second that. Thank you.
Thank you. To assist Councillor Sinfield, is there any opposition on this item? There appears to be some opposition. So I'll move to you as the mover of the motion to speak to your motion, Councillor Sinfield.
Thank you. I think it's important to respond to what we've heard tonight, and I thank the community for joining us. And in doing so, I'm happy to move the motion that is on the screen. I feel the appropriate place for this process, which I feel is more of a policy, is to be annexed to the Heritage Action Plan, or whatever the strategy document might be called in its new form. I thank the officers for preparing this process, but I feel it's more of a starting point, and I'm sorry, but it doesn't align with, apparently doesn't align with community expectation that we've heard tonight. And so I think we've missed the mark a little bit with this. And as we've been reminded tonight, we're here to be the voice for the community. And the City of Boroondara has, very publicly in recent years said that we would like to reach a position where our community come first and we're a customer-centric or community-centric organisation. So I believe we've seen an increase in nominations in recent times due to the increased appreciation of heritage, coupled with our community spending a substantially increased amount of time walking their 5-kilometre neighbourhood, noticing properties that perhaps they haven't previously noticed. I think reassessment requests are largely because the result does not align with community expectation. I appreciate the resource-intensive approach at present. However, the risk of batching up a group is out of step with community expectation, and an annual process, for me, is too infrequent and presents risk. The limiting nature of Criterion H is also out of step with community expectation. And let's not forget, the Minister will change in November, regardless of what happens at the election, because the current Minister, I believe, is retiring. I'm really concerned by the lack of community consultation on this, and I suspect it was because the response was anticipated, as we've overwhelmingly heard tonight. But that in itself raises an alarm for me. The key takeaways for me, apart from needing to rework what we've put together that's been discussed tonight, is that the community needs more information on assessments based on beauty. We can't. We're really limited, and we can't assess properties for heritage value based on beauty, which is a huge shame, but we can't. But But at the same time, I think the organisation probably and the council needs to do more as far as advocacy with the government is concerned on their behalf, so that there is perhaps some ground to be gained in that area to align with community expectation. So I'll leave my comments there. I'm happy to discuss any major flaws in this motion that anybody sees on the screen, and I commend it to you.
Thank you, Councillor Sinfield. Do other councillors seek to speak to this item? I have Councillor Stavry, you knocked your light off, and so Councillor Franco, you're next.
Thank you. I largely share the views expressed by Councillor Sinfield on this, and while I'd slightly reword the words of the motion, I'm comfortable supporting what Councillor Sinfield has proposed. My view in the ideal world is that this would best be considered as part of the Heritage Action Plan, where the Heritage Action Plan would go out on public consultation with a view, and we could see publicly where it sits within the processes that are outlined there and actions and other strategic directions that are flagged. And so I think there's merit in that and combining the public consultation there. But look, that's just a thought and a suggestion. I think it's important that I see a benefit in this having come to the council chamber and having had the opportunity for all of us, council officers and councillors, to hear the views and reactions that members of the public and the submissions we've received, which have been quite detailed. They've opened my eyes and have allowed me to see this document and some of the concerns that have been raised. So, look, I actually think it's something to welcome that we've had this dialogue here today, and I've benefited from it myself. So I'm happy to support the process that Councillor Sinfield has spelled out. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Our next councillor to speak is Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I concur with what Councillor Franco's just said. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to hear from our officers and obviously, importantly, our community this evening as well. And certainly thank everyone for devoting their time to come here and put forward presentations. I look at the Heritage Advisory Committee terms of reference, and if I may just quote one sentence from that, which is that the purpose of the Heritage Advisory Committee, one of the roles and responsibilities is to act as an accessible interface and resource for the community on heritage issues, and then in reference to our Berendara Community Plan, Theme 4, which reflects neighbourhood character and heritage, is that one of our strategic objectives is to protect heritage places through ongoing implementation of heritage protection controls in the Berendara planning scheme. So look, I completely understand the issue with resources, and I understand how time-consuming it has been for officers, particularly during 2 years of COVID and operating under difficult conditions. But I am very concerned with the motion put forward tonight as the original motion before Councillor Sinfield's proposed resolution there at the moment, that it's too prescriptive, too restrictive and too ambiguous, and it's putting all the onus back on officers and taking responsibility away from councillors. And my preference would be for councillors to lead this, and I strongly support a policy. I strongly support a review, ideally in unison with the Heritage Action Plan, and whether the Heritage Action Plan does form a strategy document as opposed to an action plan. But I believe that we need to give this matter a lot more consideration, and I'll leave my comments there. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hollingsworth. Our next speaker is our Mayor, Councillor Addis.
Thanks very much, Chair. I thought I probably needed to speak to why I don't support this motion, because it probably seems very at odds with somebody who's lived in a heritage house for 45 years and always sought to protect it and any other house that has heritage value. But I think as councillors, it's really important that we actually be a voice for all of our community. And not all our community loves heritage or appreciates it or wants us to keep spending money on things that have little prospect of success in the heritage arena. The way I read the officer's recommendation and the flow chart was that it well took care of any situation where it could be validly argued that there was a good reason to need to reassess, that there'd been a mistake or something had been forgotten or there was new information. It seemed to me that it well covered any of the concerns that I agree the community rightly has, that we should protect properties that are truly eligible for protection. But what we shouldn't be doing, and I think what this flowchart sought to stop, was subjecting people who have been through a very arduous process, who have had the stress of often fighting a heritage amendment, and who, in the end, their properties haven't been covered. And, you know, you'd think that was for good reason. We have a very rigorous process that will protect properties that are eligible for protection and leaves out those properties that aren't eligible for protection. But what I see this trying to do is avoid us going back again and again and subjecting people to another trauma when we'd already just put it to bed. And it also stops money that could be, I think, better spent for our community on other things, not being spent on this. And I'm sorry, thank you for the bell.
You do have 25 seconds, Councillor Radis.
Done, thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Councillor Gillies.
Thank you, Chair. This is undoubtedly a real challenge. Our task is to strike a workable balance between the administration needs and the community concerns for properties not protected by heritage overlay, and to satisfy the request. We all want, the community, the officers, councillors, we've all said we want to see a nomination process in place. And I thank the presenters and I thank the officers, because yes, a huge amount of work goes into anything to do with heritage and considering how we're going to manage processes around heritage. We've heard strong concerns about the restricted scope of some of the criterion. Much of this report, though, is actually to be welcomed. For example, it allows council to engage a panel of consultants outside of just the contract we currently have. It offers a fast tracking of properties that are under threat of demolition. It offers a publicly accessible nomination form for potential efficiencies, and efficiency is in the public interest too. However, what appears to be a strict requirement with criterion H is, in my view, creating unnecessary concern and confusion for the community. The intent here is to work with and on behalf of the community. Therefore, I think we need a process that has included community in its development. I think we would be wise to review this process, including consideration of a strategic document and where the nomination process fits within that. And on the basis of, I think we just haven't quite got it right. Won't take a lot more work, but I think we need to put some more work into it. Therefore, I will be supporting the deferment. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Gillies. Our next councillor to speak, Councillor Stavrou.
Thank you, Chairman. Look, I put my hand up to oppose this, not that I'm opposed to heritage. I certainly am fully supportive of heritage and what our community is saying to us and what we're doing for the community. And in fact, I'm not that opposed to what Councillor Sinfield put up as an alternative motion. I guess where I'm coming from is that this today is not about changing the strategic direction. This is streamlining and putting together a process so that it's clarifying for everybody as to what it is when community nominates a property. So as such, I'm concerned that the debate is becoming somewhat of a sort of creating a context that we're changing and making heritage different. It's not about that at all. We're not trying to change that. The only concern that I had was for fairness to be in place, and meaning that the issues that the community raised about potential properties not being able to be nominated are already included in the process that was put forward before. So even though I'm against it, I do think that there's a need to have some sort of explanatory context around what this process will mean so that the community can understand that. So to that extent, even though I said I'm opposed to it, I would like to have some more clarity, but I don't like an indefinite delay for officers and the executive to wait forever to come up with something that would work. I think we need to do it quickly because a process is evidently needed, and I think the only thing that's missing is an explanatory context to say that this is not intended to change your heritage application and limit your opportunities. It's intended to clarify them, and on that basis, I will still be opposed to it. But I think I hope it goes whichever way it does.
Thank you, Councillor Stavrou. Noted. Our next speaker is Councillor Watson.
Thank you, Chair. And I think that Councillor Addison, Councillor Stavrou have really sort of pulled together some of the thoughts that I had about this. So I'll keep my comments brief, but try and express my thoughts in my own words. I see value in the motion that's before us, but I can't support it because at the moment we are in an ad hoc or quite anarchic, in a situation of anarchy. We have no structure. I think that what the officers have put together for us tonight in terms of, I see it as a very high-level process. I think that's a perfectly acceptable interim step, that adopting the process that's been put forward for us tonight will cover us while and provide a degree of certainty for our community. And that's what we're here to do. We're here to provide frameworks, these frameworks and the certainty around processes, because without that, we're having council resources put into essentially the abyss. There is no control over this. There is no certainty. And picking up on what Councillor Addis said, we need to be a voice for everyone. We're hearing from our community who are passionate about heritage. In times past in this chamber, we hear from members of our community who are not. And we have to remember those silent voices. This is the property market we're talking about. We have a Minister for Planning and who has also a very big say in this. And so we have to always be mindful that he sets the direction, and heading into a place where we're essentially saying that chaos is okay, and that putting forward properties that have little prospect or no prospect of the Minister coming to a view that is worthy of heritage protection, and knowing, in full knowledge, that we are spending tens of thousands of dollars satisfying a community, a portion of our community that wants to have their voice heard on heritage protection, I think is failing in our duty as councillors. We're here to provide certainty, we're here to provide governance, we're here to represent the voice of everyone. I urge councillors to reject this motion, to pass it, and I'll be happy to move the officer's recommendation at the appropriate time, with a view to perhaps doing this work
a little later. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Watson. Councillor Park.
Thank you, Chair. As a starting point, I generally adopt what Councillor Gillies had to say. I think that expressed my point of view fairly well. Councillor Stavrou referred to this as a streamlining exercise. It's much, much more than that, because this so-called process document actually seeks to fundamentally change the way we do things. So it's not a situation of capturing the status quo, but rather what it does is make significant change. My view is that this clearly lies within the Heritage Action Plan, which, as I mentioned, is more than a year overdue for review. It was adopted in May 2016 and expresses at clause 9 that it be reviewed 5 years after implementation. I note that in the report at page 244, it says that when referring to the proposed new Heritage Action Plan, that actions which may be identified include new heritage studies, engagement strategies, and heritage promotion activities. Surely that's the sort of document where this whole process absolutely should rest. I mean, where are we if we can't engage the community? And this is actually a key part of that community engagement. It seems to me that the approach that's been taken with this document and the peculiar nomenclature of process versus policy, and thereby that being some escape from the need to consult, it strikes me as bizarre, and certainly this is a document that needed public consultation, and I'm glad that we appear to now be heading in that direction. I think it's important that we do it right rather than do it quickly, and I think the best outcome would be that it be done as part of the new Heritage Action Plan.
Thank you, Councillor Park. Before I return to the mover, do any other councillors who haven't spoken wish to speak? There being none, I'll return to the mover of the motion, Councillor Sinfield.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, colleagues, for your feedback on this, particularly Councillor Gillies, who I think encapsulated many of the points that I should have raised that I did not. And it was remiss of me not to remark on the very positive components of what is before us tonight. Time is no barrier here, so I think for the sake of an additional few weeks, we should try and get this right. And I'm not proposing for a moment that this be adjourned with no date, adjourned sine die for months or years down the track. I think that it should be, as efficiently dealt with as possible for both our officers and the community. Councillor Addis remarked that we shouldn't be revisiting properties again and again, and this does not seek to do that. Essentially, it's just a deferral. That's what it is, and I could have left it at just the first sentence, but I thought that it was really important to make sure that the community felt heard and encapsulate some of the points that they've raised with us tonight and highlight that in points A to F. But our continued review of this process and what it looks like moving forward is not limited to a review of A to F. It is to bring back something that aligns better with community expectation. Now, the word heritage has been identified 24 times in the Boroondara Community Plan, so I don't think this is unreasonable to do that. I hope that we have a majority to get this across the line tonight, because I think that that's what's fair and reasonable in the circumstances. And I'll leave my comments there. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Sinfield. I'll now put the motion on the screen to the vote. All those in favour? Those against? I declare the motion carried. Thank you, councillors. We'll move on to our next item of business, which is general business. Are there any items of general business? Councillor Franco, did you wish to raise anything?
Thank you, Chair. I was going to raise the issue of the possibility of looking at the possibly merits and implications of making the possible heritage layer publicly accessible, but I think it's sufficiently covered by the motion we've just passed, point F, I think it was, and I think it can be considered as part of that. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other items of general business? Councillor Sinfield, have you got a...
No, my bad.
We'll move to items of urgent business. I believe there may be an item of urgent business that we need to admit. Councillor Addis.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. There's a motion up on the screen seeking that an item of urgent business be admitted for consideration. Would you happy to read it, or would you like?
I'm happy to read this quickly, that the Urban Planning Delegated Committee resolved to admit an item of urgent business, the matter of reduced funding for the Office of the Victorian Government Architect, because this item relates to or arises out of a matter which has arisen since the distribution of the agenda, and it cannot be deferred until the next Urban Planning Delegated Committee meeting, given pending consideration of the Municipal Association of Victoria, State Council motions and other planning reform-related advocacy. That is your motion, Councillor.
Thank you. It's a very long sentence,
It was. I'm in search of a seconder for this. Councillor Sinfield, Watson.
Wash your mouth out.
Oh no, it's late.
Happy to second, thank you.
Thank you. To assist Councillor Addis, is there any opposition to this? I'll put this motion to the vote. I declare it carried unanimously. So we can now introduce the motion. Councillor Addis, are you seeking to?
Yes, that is the motion. Yes, I've seen it before, and that looks very much like it. Thank you.
So I realise the gallery will be reading this. This has been circulated to all councillors. I'm in search of a seconder for this motion. Councillor Watson.
Yeah, happy to second.
Thank you. To assist Councillor Addis, is there any opposition? There being no opposition, Councillor Addis, do you wish to speak to this motion briefly?
Briefly, but I think I probably should defer to you, Chair, because I know this is something you feel very passionate about, but just a general comment that really this is about seeking to ensure that the best planning that possibly can happen occurs within Victoria, and I think there's some concerns that this might seek, if this goes ahead, this might seek to lessen that oversight. But I'll hand to you, Chair.
Thank you, and thank you, Councillor Addis. Yes, the Office of the Victorian Government Architect plays a very critical role as a design watchdog on projects of state significance, aka Markham Estate, Bill Street, any future developments at the Melbourne University site that might come up. Given that there's significant injection of capital funds and budgets into state-run projects, such as the housing projects, affordable housing, many other state significant projects, the defunding of the Office of the Victorian Government Architect actually pulls the rug out of critical analysis of good urban design and architecture. For us as a community, I think this is something to be very concerned with, because Markham Estate was better for the advice that the Office of the Victorian Government Architect provided to the state. Absent of that advice, we have no one to fall back on with regards to critical analysis of these designs. The state needs to reinstate the funds at a minimum. I think that's all been well accepted. No further speakers on this item. On that basis, I will put the motion to the vote. All those in favour? I declare that carried unanimously. Thank you, councillors. We'll move on to item 6, confidential business. Are there any items of confidential business? There being none, I close the meeting at 9:57 p.m. Thank you, councillors and gallery.